On June 18th, the UN Human Rights Council began its 56th session in Geneva, and freedom of expression continues to be one of the priorities on the agenda. It is also enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Freedom of expression is a fundamental right, enshrined in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. This right,
despite it being protected by the international law, 4.2 billion of us, more than half of the global population, are now living through a freedom of expression crisis. That's according to Article 19, a British international human rights organization that works to defend and promote freedom of expression and freedom of information worldwide. As you can probably tell by now, the organization takes on its name from Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They monitor threats to free expression around the world and lobby governments to adopt laws that conform to international standards of freedom of expression and draft legal standards that strengthen media, public broadcasting, free expression, and access to government-held information. Each year, they publish the Global Expression Report, which is an annual look at the right to free expression and information worldwide. According to the organization, its unique metric, based on 25 indicators of freedom of expression, tracks freedom of expression across 161 countries to create a score between 0 and 100 for each country. And that score places each country in one of 5 expression categories: open, less restricted, restricted, highly restricted, or crisis. The reports provide a concrete measure and quantifiable perspective on expression, from posting online to protesting, investigating and accessing the information needed to keep leaders accountable. In this episode of The Divide, I reached out to Article 19 and asked them about the new findings in this year's Global Expression Report.
My name is David Diaz-Jogeix, and I work for Article 19 as Senior Director of Programs. Article 19 released its Global Expression Report 2024 last week, and what is the most concerning element of this report is that more than half of the world's population, we're talking about 53%, 4.2 billion people, live in countries where freedom of expression is in crisis, and this is more people than any time this century so far.
According to the report, this growth in population in crisis countries is due to the shift of India into this expression category between 2022 and 2023. Now, if you remember, there are 5 categories a country can be put into when it comes to freedom of expression. Based on 25 indicators in a Bayesian measurement model for countries with available data between 2000 and 2023, the report rescales and rounds the value for each country and assign them a score between 0 and 100. If a country's score falls between 80 and 100, it is categorized as open. Between 60 and 79, less restricted. 40 to 59, restricted. 20 to 39, highly restricted. And from 0 to 19 is categorized as in crisis.
So we defined a crisis according to the indicators that we collect, and when countries underperform severely on most of those indicators, we consider that the environment for people to speak freely or to get access to information does not exist, and that's where we look at certain countries that have gone into the worst possible situation in terms of freedom of expression.
But what are the indicators, and how do they measure freedom of expression?
We collect about 25 indicators on freedom of expression. These are brought from Varieties of Democracy, which is a global gathering of data around the quality of democracy in the world, and we pick those 25 indicators that pertain to freedom of expression. So those goes from the right to protest to the freedom of the media, harassment of journalists, internet censorship, and so on. And that's where we actually then look at those indicators year by year, and then out of that we come up with this global expression index.
And in this index, 9 countries were identified by Article 19 to be falling back into a more restricted expression category, including Burkina Faso, which fell from less restricted to highly restricted. Central African Republic, from restricted to highly restricted. Ecuador, from less restricted to restricted. Ethiopia, from highly restricted to crisis. India, from highly restricted to crisis. Moldova, from open to less restricted. Mongolia, from less restricted to restricted. Senegal, from less restricted to restricted. And finally, Togo, from restricted to highly restricted. And among these countries, one particular stood out.
I think India is kind of like a hidden story when people reflect on India as the largest democracy in the world. Yet we can see in the last decade how India has gone from highly restricted category last year. If you look at in India a 35-point decline in its score over the past 10 years since Narendra Modi became the prime minister in 2014. So we had 24 out of those 25 freedom of expression indicators declined. So that goes for a range of issues, from imposing the highest number of internet shutdowns to muzzling journalists and independent media and political opposition, or ordering social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram to block hundreds of activists, social media accounts and posts, or also ordering YouTube to block channels of independent media houses, and that in a context of hate speech by political leaders against the Muslim population and other religious minorities in India. Just to give you an example, in a recent speech, Prime Minister Narendra Modi termed the Muslim population in India as infiltrators who have lots of children, which is despicable.
Besides India, Ethiopia also fell from highly restricted to crisis.
Yes, that's correct. And I think that's in the context of the internal armed conflict that the country is going through, and how this is actually affecting both in terms of the lack of protection to journalists, but also the high level of internet shutdowns that are taking place in moments of crisis. And then these are precisely at moments of crisis when people need more information, and access to critical sources of information can be life-saving.
Apart from the 9 countries that fell out of their previous category, Article 19 documented that 46 countries have experienced a negative shift in expression categories since 2000, and that less than a quarter of the global population, 23%, live in open and less restricted expression environments. But there are some countries that have advanced into a more positive expression category. They are Fiji, Brazil, Niger, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. Among them, Brazil went from restricted to open.
Yeah, so Brazil is very interesting because, it went through a drop with Jair Bolsonaro, the right populist president, extreme right populist, and it dropped into a restricted country in terms of freedom of expression. With the arrival or the return of Lula Silva to government in 2022, we saw a 26 point increase in its score, moving two categories from restricted to open, So we had advances in 17 of these freedom expression indicators, So we saw the improvement with less harassment of journalists, or an increase of civil society freedoms, the way that civil society and NGOs can actually operate, or a better environment conducive to protest in a peaceful manner without police repression, But also I think there's an effort from the government to become much more transparent and, coming up with consultations and participatory politics that has allowed the overall freedom of expression in the country notably improve, which is a great success,
As we continue to talk about the categories, I wanted to know what are the common challenges faced by the country in the crisis or restricted categories?
So there is like two big different, let's say, categories of countries. You have countries that have been authoritarian for a long time, in which the freedom of expression has been suppressed for a long period of time, and this could be the case of mainland China, or you could have countries that deteriorate very rapidly, as we have seen, for example, the case in India, or we have seen in countries like Nicaragua that went from middle range type of freedom of expression country into completely a country in crisis, and I think its global score is 2, which is atrocious, So certain countries are very authoritarian and continue to be, and therefore the freedom of expression continues to be bad. And then we have countries with the surge of populism, with the surge of weak democracies, or democracies becoming much more authoritarian in their policies, becoming much more restricted, And for example, I want to highlight the case in the United States, where the United States has declined across 9 indicators in terms of freedom of expression. So that includes from peaceful assembly and the right to protest to a freedom of academic exchange, as we could see from the protests in the universities on the Israeli-Palestinian armed conflict.
So, according to David, there are some democracies that implement authoritarian policies. What are the policies that tend to suppress the freedom of expression?
Yes, I think, one is, there's an overall limitation on the right to protest, and we have seen that fairly across the world. Then the other key element on repression is digital online censorship, whether it's internet shutdowns or limitation of access to information through online on the basis of legislation that looks at security but doesn't really consider the human rights obligations on how to limit freedom of expression.
After exploring the data in this report, I asked David if it is possible to make any predictions based on the current data that Article 19 has gathered.
So it's very, as anything in social science, it's very difficult to make predictions. What is very, very clear is where the trends are actually going, and we have seen, not only an increase of countries in crisis, but also we have seen how champions of freedom of expression have their indicators on freedom of expression dropping. Like I referred to the United States, I could refer to the UK, or we could refer into many of other countries that have been traditionally democratic and traditionally pro freedom of expression, but this becoming less and less tolerable.
Over the last decade, 6.2 billion people across 78 countries experienced a deterioration of their freedom of expression. Only 303 million people across 18 countries saw improvement. And the largest declines over the last 10 years took place in Hong Kong, Afghanistan, and El Salvador. And in the past year alone, the percentage of people living in countries where freedom of expression is considered in crisis rose from 34% in 2022 to 53% in 2023. Now, the 46 countries that have regressed in the past year should do better. But what can they do? What kind of policies should they make?
Yes, I think, you keep looking and keep referring to international human rights standards when you actually go through legislation, whether these are legislation that looks into protest or looks into internet freedoms, access to information online, or is simply independent regulatory bodies of the audiovisual that allows the public to have a variety of information. So I think it's critical to keep referring to human rights and translate human rights into concrete policies that allow citizens to know the information they really want, that they can use that information to hold authorities in check, and that's precisely why many of the authoritarian regimes do not want access to information, because that would expose some of the wrongdoings and other internal corruption.
And for ordinary citizens, there's also something that you can do to help maintain or improve freedom of expression.
Yeah, I think it's important for citizens to be aware of what their rights is. If they have issues that they really need to talk about, proactively look for the information, and do not subestimate the power that people have. Whether this is demonstrating, whether this is talking in the communities and raising the issues to make sure that the authorities hear about these grievances and are actually challenged on those issues that matter to people.
At the end of our discussion, I asked David what surprises him the most about this year's report.
For me, it's been the breadth of countries, and behind the countries is the actual citizens, that are living in countries where there's no freedom of expression, where they cannot share or they cannot express, grievances that they might have in terms of the economy, in terms of living, in cost of crisis, the cost of living, or access to health, and I think that's daily reality of many people's lives, not being able to talk about, express, dissent, come up with solutions, and engage with the community and the authorities. I think this is incredible, so this for me is not numbers. We're talking about people trying to really talk about the issues that they care most,
I think David just reminded all of us of the most important thing about this report: to not be fixated on the numbers, categories, indicators, but to really understand the meanings, the struggle, the desire behind them. If you're interested in the report, go to globalexpressionreport.org and find out how your country is doing when it comes to freedom of expression. My name is Iris Xu. Thank you for listening to The Divide. This episode is produced by Radio Taiwan International.